The morning of November 20th, 1943, Red Beach 2, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Private First Class William Bordelon waded through chest-deep water, coral cutting through his boots, machine gun fire stitching the lagoon around him. He could see the seawall ahead, 300 yards away. Men were falling everywhere, their bodies floating face down in water turned pink by blood. The landing craft that should have carried them to shore sat stranded on the reef 500 yards behind them. The Japanese gunners in their concrete pillboxes could not believe what they were seeing. The Americans were wading across the reef that was supposed to stop them, the reef that made Betio invincible. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had spent 15 months turning this tiny coral spit into what he believed was the most fortified position on Earth. Over 500 pillboxes and firing pits, 8-inch coastal guns, coconut log bunkers reinforced with steel and concrete, interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of beach. He had told his men that 1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years, but here they were, crossing the reef, not in boats, but on foot, wading through water that should have been their grave, closing the distance inch by bloody inch toward the shore. And in those first terrible hours, as Marines continued to come, continued to wade, continued to die but never stopped advancing, the Japanese defenders began to understand a truth that would echo through the remaining 76 hours of hell. The reef could be crossed, and if the reef could be crossed, Tarawa could fall. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of Tarawa begins with a profound miscalculation on both sides. The Americans underestimated what they would face. The Japanese underestimated what their enemy could endure. Both mistakes would be paid for in blood. In November 1943, the United States was ready to begin its Central Pacific campaign. After Guadalcanal's grinding attrition and Midway's carrier duel, American strategists had settled on a strategy: island hopping. Seize key atolls, build airfields, leapfrog closer to Japan. The Gilbert Islands, 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii, would be the first step, and within the Gilberts, the primary target was Tarawa Atoll, specifically its largest island, Betio. Betio was tiny, 2 miles long, 800 yards at its widest point, 291 acres of coral and sand. It barely rose 10 feet above sea level. But Betio had an airfield. With that airfield, American bombers could reach the Marshall Islands, the next stepping stone toward Tokyo. The Japanese understood Betio's strategic value perfectly. They had seized the Gilbert Islands within 3 days of Pearl Harbor. For nearly 2 years, they worked to turn Betio into a fortress. What they created was unlike anything American forces had yet encountered. The first architect of Betio's defenses was Rear Admiral Tomonari Saichiro, who arrived in August 1942. Saichiro was a superb engineer who understood defensive fortifications. His assignment was clear: make Betio so formidable that any American assault would be destroyed at the water's edge. Saichiro began with the beach. A 4-foot-high seawall of coconut logs and coral ran along almost the entire northern shore. Behind this, he supervised construction of pillboxes, concrete and coconut log bunkers, virtually immune to naval gunfire. The coconut logs were dense, fibrous, capable of absorbing explosive force without shattering. When layered with sand, coral and steel reinforcement, these pillboxes could withstand direct hits from 14-inch naval shells. The Japanese constructed over 500 of these fortifications across Betio. Each pillbox had carefully calculated fields of fire, overlapping with neighboring positions, so that no area of beach was left uncovered. Many were connected by underground tunnels, allowing defenders to move unseen, to reinforce threatened positions, to disappear and reappear elsewhere. Artillery positions covered both ocean approaches and the lagoon. 8-inch Vickers guns pointed seaward. 75mm mountain guns covered the beaches. 13mm heavy machine guns were positioned with interlocking fields of fire. The defences extended into the water, Barbed wire wrapped around coral heads beneath the surface. Mines were placed in likely landing areas. Concrete tetrahedrons blocked vehicle approaches, and surrounding the entire island, between 400 and 600 yards offshore, lay the coral reef itself. This reef was Betio's natural moat. At high tide, it was covered by 3 to 4 feet of water. At low tide, it was exposed or covered by only inches. Landing craft would ground on it, forcing troops to wade hundreds of yards through shallow water under direct fire. The reef was razor-sharp coral that could slice through boots and shred flesh. Japanese planners understood that American success depended on speed. Get troops ashore quickly, establish a beachhead, overwhelm the defenders with firepower. The reef would slow everything down. It would turn American mobility into a killing field. In August 1943, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki arrived to take command. Shibasaki was an experienced combat officer who had fought in China. He immediately continued and intensified the fortification program. Shibasaki brought additional troops. The Sasebo 7th Special Naval Landing Force, Elite Naval Infantry, the 3rd Special Base Force, combat-capable defensive troops, the 111th Pioneers, construction troops who could fight, the 4th Fleet Construction Unit, including over 1,000 Korean labourers. By November, Betio was defended by approximately 4,700 Japanese troops and over 2,000 construction workers. Nearly 5,000 men, armed with excellent weapons, dug into prepared positions, commanded by officers who believed absolutely in their mission. Shibasaki told his men something that became famous. He told them that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. It was not empty boasting. Shibasaki believed it. The Americans would have to cross the reef under fire. They would arrive exhausted, scattered, disorganized. Japanese guns would cut them down in the water. Naval gunfire would be ineffective against the deeply buried bunkers. The battle would be won in the first hours. Shibasaki was not alone in this assessment. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit and prepared defensive positions. Tarawa was positioned in Japan's zone of absolute defense, fortified islands to be held to the last man, making the Americans pay such a high cost, but that they would eventually negotiate peace. The Americans approached Tarawa with dangerous confidence. Operation Galvanic was planned as relatively straightforward. Intelligence had identified Betio's defences. Photo reconnaissance had plotted gun positions and counted pillboxes. American planners knew they would face serious resistance, but they believed overwhelming firepower would solve the problem. The invasion fleet was the largest yet committed to a single Pacific operation. 17 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 66 destroyers, 36 transport ships. This armada carried 18,000 Marines of the 2nd Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal. The battle plan was simple. For a week, planes would bomb Betio. On the assault morning, battleships would bombard the island for hours. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner promised the bombardment would pound Betio to coral dust. Not a single defender would be left alive. After the Grafe bombardment, Marines would land in amphibious tractors called LVTs, nicknamed alligators. These vehicles could crawl over reefs. Their treads would carry Marines directly to the beach, protected by armour, delivered quickly enough to overwhelm any surviving defenders. The operation was expected to take a few hours. One officer called it a walk in the park. Only one problem worried some planners: the tides. Tarawa experienced neap tides, periods when the difference between high and low tide was minimal. The water over the reef might never rise high enough for standard landing craft. Major Frank Holland, who had lived in the Pacific, warned that neap tides could leave the reef exposed. His warnings were noted and dismissed. The tide tables said there would be enough water. November 19, 1943. The American fleet arrived at Tarawa. At dawn on the 20th, the bombardment would begin, followed by the landing at 9 to 10. Aboard the transports, Marines checked weapons, wrote last letters, tried to sleep. Most believed they would be ashore by mid-morning, the island secured by nightfall. In pre-dawn darkness, Marines climbed down cargo nets into landing craft. The sea was rougher than expected. Some men fell into the water. The LVTs bobbed in the swells. At 5:07, before the scheduled bombardment, Japanese shore batteries opened fire. They had detected the fleet. Surprise was lost. American battleships returned fire immediately. The Maryland's 16-inch guns roared. The Colorado, Tennessee, Pennsylvania added their firepower. For over 2 hours, American ships pounded the tiny island. 6 million pounds of explosives hit Betio. To observers on the ships, it seemed impossible that anything could survive. But the bombardment ended 40 minutes behind schedule. The assault waves had to continue circling, burning fuel, with seasick Marines vomiting. At 8:55, Admiral Hill ordered ceasefire. Airstrikes that were supposed to hit immediately before the landing were delayed. For several crucial minutes, no fire fell on Betio. The defenders had time to emerge from shelters, to man weapons, to prepare. The Japanese had survived. The deeply buried bunkers, the pillboxes reinforced with coconut logs, the underground positions had protected the defenders. Most of the Sasebo 7th Special Naval Landing Force was alive, armed, and ready. At 9 to 10, the first wave of LVTs crossed the line of departure and began their run to the beach. 42 alligators carrying approximately 1,400 Marines. They would hit 3 beaches, Red Beach 1, 2, and 3. The LVTs moved slowly, wallowing in the swells. The men could see Betio ahead, smoke rising, but they could also see splashes in the water. Japanese fire had begun. Then the LVTs reached the reef. The water over the reef was less than 2 feet deep. Standard landing craft could not possibly cross. Japanese gunners opened fire with everything. Machine guns raked the LVTs. 75mm guns fired directly at the vehicles. Mortars dropped shells into the lagoon. LVTs began to burn. Some took direct hits and exploded. Others were disabled by machine gun fire. Marines inside crouched low, unable to return fire, feeling each impact, wondering if the next shell would find them. Some LVTs made it to the beach. They crashed over the seawall, dropped their ramps, and Marines poured out into hell. Japanese fire came from everywhere, from positions the bombardment had not touched, but other LVTs never made it. They were hit on the reef, or broke down, or were stopped by obstacles. Marines had to dismount into the water, still hundreds of yards from shore, and wade in under fire. This was the moment when Japanese defenders began to realize something was wrong. The Americans were not stopping. The reef was killing them. The water was killing them. Japanese guns were killing them. But they kept coming. By 9:45, the 1st, Marines were ashore on Red Beach 3. Major Jim Crow's battalion had caught a break. Destroyers had provided close fire support, suppressing Japanese positions. Crow's battalion suffered only 25 casualties in the first wave and established a foothold. On Red Beach 2, the situation was worse. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Amey's battalion came ashore under murderous fire. Amey was killed within minutes, shot through the head. His battalion scattered along the beach, pinned down. On Red Beach 1, Major John Schotel's battalion faced a nightmare. Japanese guns could fire along the length of the beach. LVTs were hit from multiple angles. Marines who made it ashore found themselves trapped against the seawall with no room to advance. Then the second and third waves arrived in standard landing craft. The tide had not risen. The Higgins boats grounded 500, 600, sometimes 700 yards from shore. Marines were ordered to disembark, to wade in, to cover 500 yards of open water, chest deep, with coral cutting their feet, under fire from Japanese positions. What followed was slaughter. Marines climbed over the sides and immediately came under fire. Machine gun bullets walked across the water. Artillery shells burst among groups wading toward shore. The water was too shallow to dive for cover. The coral made running impossible. The only choice was to keep moving forward. Private First Class James Peavy stepped off his landing craft. He took 3 steps and was shot through both legs. He fell forward, tried to crawl, was shot again through the back. He drowned in 18 inches of water. Corporal Thomas Stockdale helped wounded men toward shore. He made 2 trips carrying injured Marines. On his 3rd trip, returning to help more wounded, he was hit across the chest. He died instantly. The wading Marines could see the beach, see Marines already ashore fighting, but the distance seemed impossible. Every yard took minutes. Every step exposed them to fire from multiple positions. Men were hit, fell, tried to get up, were hit again. Some Marines made it part way and could go no further. Exhausted, wounded, weighted down with equipment, they collapsed and drowned. Others found slight depressions in the reef and huddled there, unable to advance but unwilling to turn back. The pier jutting into the lagoon became both refuge and death trap. Marines used it for cover, working along its length toward shore. But Japanese gunners fired at anyone near the pier. Bodies hung from the pilings. The water around the pier was stained dark with blood. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-morning, approximately 5,000 Marines had reached Betio's beaches, but 1,500 were already casualties. The beach was littered with bodies. The lagoon was choked with wreckage. Destroyed LVTs burned in shallow water. And yet the assault had not failed. Despite casualties that would have broken most military units, despite facing exactly the killing field that Shibasaki had prepared, the Marines were ashore, and they were fighting. Colonel David Shoup waded ashore at approximately 1100 hours. He established his command post behind the seawall, exposed to Japanese fire. Shrapnel had torn through his leg, but he refused evacuation. His radio equipment was soaked and barely functional. Shoup radioed division headquarters. Have landed. Unusually heavy opposition. Casualties 70%. Can't hold. The message reached Major General Julian Smith aboard the Maryland. Casualties 70%. Smith faced a decision. Reinforce or withdraw. Smith chose to reinforce. He committed his reserves, ordering support ships to move closer. He sent a message to Shoup. Hold what you have. Reinforcements coming. Shoup gathered his officers. They would attack, not retreat. Attack now, with what they had. The Marines would fight their way inland, position by position, pillbox by pillbox. Japanese defenders watched the Americans organize and could not believe what they were seeing. These Marines should be broken. They should be retreating. They had suffered casualties that would have destroyed any Japanese unit. And yet they were preparing to attack. From his command bunker, Shibasaki attempted to assess the situation. Reports were fragmentary, but it was clear the Americans had established a foothold. They were not in great numbers, but they were there, on Betio, on the island that was not supposed to fall. Shibasaki ordered a counterattack, but the counterattack never developed. His communications were too disrupted, and American naval gunfire began to fall with devastating accuracy on any concentration of Japanese troops. Destroyers moved into the lagoon, firing 5-inch guns at targets Marines marked with smoke grenades. The Japanese garrison found itself in an impossible situation. They had prepared for a certain type of battle, decided at the water's edge. Those defenses had killed thousands of Americans, but it had not been enough. The Americans had crossed the reef. They had endured casualties that should have stopped them, and now the battle neither side had fully anticipated was beginning. Part 2. The long night of November 20th descended on Betio. Marines huddled behind the seawall, in shell craters, in whatever cover they could find. They expected a banzai charge. Officers told their men to fix bayonets, but the charge never came. Shibasaki tried desperately to organize his scattered forces. His communication lines had been severed. Runners sent between positions often never arrived. He could not coordinate the massive assault that might have driven the Americans into the sea. Individual Japanese positions launched small counterattacks throughout the night. A squad would charge the marine lines with rifles and grenades, fight desperately, then be annihilated. These attacks accomplished nothing except to reveal Japanese positions. By dawn on November 21st, the situation remained desperate but not hopeless. About 5,000 Marines were ashore, holding a discontinuous line. The deepest penetration was on Red Beach 3. On Red Beach 2, Colonel Shoup's men held a narrow strip. On Red Beach 1, Marines clung to positions at the seawall, unable to advance. The tide problem continued, landing craft still grounded on the reef. But Marines were learning. They identified routes where the water was slightly deeper. They marked these routes with flags. Engineers worked under fire to clear paths through obstacles, blowing up concrete tetrahedrons, cutting barbed wire. Tanks began to arrive. M4 Sherman medium tanks rumbled over the reef. The Japanese had light tanks, Type 95 Hargos, but these were no match for Shermans. In one engagement near the airfield, a Sherman destroyed 3 Japanese tanks in minutes. The Sherman's real value was reducing fortified positions. They would approach a pillbox, absorbing machine gun fire, and fire high-explosive shells directly into firing slits, or they would park in front of a bunker and fire repeatedly until it collapsed. Marines followed behind using flamethrowers and demolition charges. Major William Chamberlain's battalion landed and immediately pushed inland. They advanced along the southern shore, clearing bunkers and trenches. The fighting was vicious. Every pillbox had to be taken individually. Flamethrowers burned defenders alive. Grenades were dropped through ventilation shafts. Demolition charges collapsed structures, burying everyone inside. Japanese defenders fought with desperation. Wounded soldiers would wait until Marines approached, then detonate grenades. Others would feign death, then rise up and attack. Marines learned to trust nothing. Every body was assumed alive until proven otherwise. The fighting became methodical, systematic, brutal. Colonel Shoup coordinated the advance with whatever communication he could manage. His command post remained exposed, within range of snipers and mortars. He realized something crucial. The Japanese defensive strategy depended on interlocking fields of fire. If one bunker was destroyed, it created a gap that could be exploited to attack the next bunker from the side. The tactic required coordination. Tanks, infantry, engineers, and flamethrower teams working together. It was slow and costly, but it worked. Gradually, position by position, the defensive network was being dismantled. Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman led his men against what appeared to be the largest bunker on Betio, a massive structure near Red Beach 3, built of concrete and coconut logs, covered with sand. Intelligence believed this might be Shibasaki's command post. Bonnyman gathered 21 engineers and troops. They approached from the rear. Japanese defenders opened fire from the top. Bonnyman charged up the sloped side, firing his carbine, throwing grenades. His men followed. The fight lasted several minutes. Japanese defenders emerged from hatches to engage Marines in hand-to-hand combat. Bonnyman was shot multiple times but continued fighting until he collapsed. 5 other Marines were killed, but the position was taken. Engineers placed demolition charges and detonated them. The explosion brought down part of the roof. Marines then systematically cleared the surviving portions using flamethrowers. The captured bunker did prove to be a major command facility. Admiral Shibasaki was not in that bunker. He had moved his command post that afternoon. At approximately 1500 hours, as he was moving between positions, American naval gunfire struck near his location. A 5-inch shell killed Shibasaki and several staff officers. The death of the Japanese commander effectively ended organized resistance. Junior officers continued to fight, but there was no longer central coordination. Each bunker became an isolated strongpoint with no support, no communication, no overall strategy beyond inflicting maximum casualties. By late afternoon, Marines controlled approximately half of Betio. The western end, including Green Beach, had been secured by Major Michael Ryan's improvised battalion. With destroyer support, Ryan's forces cleared the western portion in coordinated attacks. The tide finally turned, literally. Late afternoon, the water level rose enough for landing craft to cross. Reinforcements, supplies, ammunition poured ashore. Wounded were evacuated. Fresh troops moved inland. The 6th Marines landed on Green Beach and immediately attacked eastward. They encountered fierce resistance but had the advantage of numbers, support, and momentum. Japanese defenders, depleted by 2 days of combat, could not stop the advance. That night, Marines waited for the banzai charge. Officers told their men to prepare. Flares were fired to illuminate the ground. Machine guns were sighted to create killing zones. The attack came around midnight, but it was not the organized assault that might have succeeded the previous night. It was desperate charges by small groups who had been bypassed or emerged from bunkers Marines thought cleared. One group of 50 Japanese sailors charged Marine lines near the airfield. They broke through the first line and reached a command post before being stopped. A firefight lasted 10 minutes. All 50 Japanese were dead, along with 3 Marines. Another group attacked Colonel Shoup's command post. They were spotted by sentries and engaged immediately. Illumination flares lit the area. Machine guns opened fire. The attack was stopped within 50 yards. A larger attack, perhaps 200 men, hit the junction between the 2nd and 8th Marines near the island's centre. Fighting was hand-to-hand in places. The battle raged for over an hour before attackers were killed or driven back. These suicide charges accomplished nothing strategically. They did not retake ground. They merely killed the remaining effective Japanese fighters, leaving bunkers undermanned. But the charges fulfilled the requirements of Japanese military honor. The men had died attacking, not defending. Dawn on November 22nd revealed a transformed Betio. Smoke rose from destroyed bunkers. Palm trees were shattered stumps. Bodies lay everywhere. The stench was overwhelming. Marines resumed their advance at first light. The tactic was refined. Identify a position. Suppress it with gunfire. Bring up a tank. The tank would fire into the bunker, then park in front, blocking the firing slit. Engineers would approach from the sides, placing satchel charges against walls. The charges would detonate, collapsing the structure. Flamethrowers were particularly horrifying. Liquid fire would flow into bunkers, filling interior spaces, consuming oxygen, burning defenders alive. Men would emerge on fire, running, screaming, until they fell or were shot. Sergeant William Bordelon, who had survived the wade to shore, volunteered repeatedly to demolish Japanese positions. He destroyed 4 positions using demolition charges and grenades. Wounded twice, he refused evacuation. On his 5th assault, he was shot multiple times and killed. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. By midday, Marines controlled 80% of Betio. Organized Japanese resistance had collapsed. What remained were isolated bunkers and small groups hiding in ruins. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Japanese defenders understood the situation. They had no chance of victory, evacuation, or survival, but they could still kill Americans. Some defenders chose individual last stands. A single soldier would hide, wait for Marines to approach, open fire, kill 1 or 2 before being killed himself. Others formed small groups and launched localized attacks. 10 or 15 men would fix bayonets and charge the nearest Marine position. They would be cut down by machine gun fire, but they died attacking. Marines examining captured fortifications were stunned by their sophistication. One officer counted 13 separate firing positions connected by tunnels, all mutually supporting. Taking it had required a tank, 2 flamethrower teams, and a platoon. 8 Marines killed, 14 wounded. And this was only one of over 500 such positions. Late on November 22nd, Marines reached the eastern tip of Betio. Organized resistance had ended. The island was American. That night brought the final desperate act. Approximately 300 survivors gathered in the island's center. They had no plan beyond one final attack. They would charge. They would die with their boots on enemy-held ground. Around midnight they emerged and charged. They came in a mass, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. Illumination flares turned night into day. Marine machine guns opened fire. Artillery fired canister rounds. The Japanese charge reached marine lines in several places but could not break through. The fighting lasted less than 30 minutes. When it ended, Japanese bodies lay in heaps. The final Banzai charge had failed. It accomplished nothing except to kill most of the remaining defenders. Dawn on November 23rd revealed the full extent of carnage. Betio looked like a nightmare. Hardly a structure remained intact. The airfield was cratered. Palm trees were shattered stumps, and everywhere were bodies. Japanese dead lay in the open, in trenches, piled in bunkers, floating in the lagoon. American dead still lay where they had fallen. The smell was overpowering. Men wrapped cloth around their faces, but it did little good. Marine burial parties began collecting American dead. Bodies were identified when possible, personal effects collected. The dead were laid in rows on the beach, over 1,000 American bodies, young men who 3 days earlier had been alive, who had families waiting, who had futures. At 13:30 hours, Major General Julian Smith came ashore to inspect Betio. He toured the battlefield, visiting every section, examining captured fortifications. What he saw shocked him. The defences were stronger than intelligence indicated. The Japanese had fought more effectively than predicted. Admiral Chester Nimitz also came ashore. He walked the beaches, saw bodies floating in the surf, saw wrecked landing craft, saw exhausted Marines. He later wrote that he had never seen such a ghastly sight. The final casualty figures told a brutal story. Of approximately 12,000 Marines who participated, 3,166 became casualties, 1,009 killed, 2,101 wounded, 88 missing, nearly one casualty for every 4 Marines. Some units suffered casualty rates exceeding 75%. The Japanese garrison was effectively annihilated. Of 4,700 Japanese troops and over 2,000 Korean laborers, only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Koreans survived. Over 4,600 Japanese dead, nearly 100% casualties. The Battle of Tarawa sent shockwaves through both nations. In America, the public was stunned by casualty figures. How could so many men die taking an island most Americans had never heard of? Newspaper headlines screamed about losses. Parents and wives of the dead demanded explanations. The War Department made a controversial decision. Combat footage was compiled into a documentary with the Marines at Tarawa, containing graphic images of dead Americans. The decision to release it went to President Franklin Roosevelt. He approved it, believing Americans needed to understand the true nature of the Pacific War. Audiences watched in stunned silence. Many left theaters crying, but the film also hardened American resolve. In Japan, news of Tarawa's fall was initially suppressed. The loss contradicted government propaganda about Japanese military superiority, but word spread through military channels. Officers who had promised fortified islands could not be taken were proven wrong. The Japanese military learned the wrong lessons from Tarawa. Instead of recognizing that static defensive lines could be overcome, they doubled down on the strategy. Future island defenses would be even more heavily fortified. More men would be committed to holding positions to the last man. The tactics that failed at Tarawa would be repeated at Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each time with the same result. The one Japanese officer who survived to be interrogated provided crucial insights. He stated that defenders had withstood bombing and bombardment. They believed their fortifications were adequate. They believed the reef would stop the Americans, but they never believed the reef could be crossed in the face of their fire. When Marines waded across the reef, when they kept coming despite casualties, the Japanese defenders knew there was no hope. The fundamental assumption of the defense had been proven false. If Americans could cross the reef, they could take Betio. If they could take Betio, they could take any island. And if they could take any island, they would eventually reach Japan. This realization was perhaps the most important result of Tarawa. The Japanese military had built a strategy around the belief that American forces would not accept necessary casualties to seize heavily fortified positions. Tarawa proved that belief wrong. American forces would accept appalling casualties if necessary. They would wade through killing fields. They would assault positions that seemed impregnable. They would persevere until victory was achieved. For the Marines, Tarawa became a proving ground. The assault demonstrated that amphibious operations against prepared defences were possible but extraordinarily costly. Every aspect was studied and improved. The tide problem led to better reconnaissance. Future operations included underwater demolition teams who would survey beaches and reefs before assault. These teams, predecessors of the Navy SEALs, would save countless lives. Naval gunfire doctrine was revised. Future bombardments would last longer, use different ammunition types, and focus on destroying fortifications. Landing craft were improved. More LVTs were built. Communications equipment was ruggedized. Medical evacuation procedures were improved. Admiral Raymond Spruance later wrote that every man lost at Tarawa saved at least 10 men in subsequent operations. The lessons were applied to the Marshall Islands invasion 10 weeks later, resulting in far fewer casualties despite similar defenses. Those lessons carried through to the Marianas, Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Marines who survived Tarawa carried the memories for life. Veterans spoke of the wade to shore, watching friends die, desperate fighting on the beach. Many have suffered what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Colonel David Shoup was awarded the Medal of Honor. He would later become Commandant of the Marine Corps. He never forgot Tarawa. Throughout his career, he emphasized proper planning, adequate preparation, and respect for the enemy. Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His body was not recovered after the battle. It remained buried in the bunker ruins for nearly 70 years. In 2015, his remains were finally identified and returned to his family. Betio Island had become a graveyard. Nearly 6,000 men died there in 76 hours. Americans, Japanese, Koreans. Most were young, in their late teens or early 20s. They died violently on an island most had never heard of. The irony was that Shibasaki had been partially right. Betio was almost impregnable. Its defences were formidable. Its garrison was brave and well-trained. But he had underestimated one critical factor. He had underestimated the Marines' willingness to pay the price necessary to take the island. He had underestimated American determination, American firepower, American industrial capacity. He had built a fortress that could withstand almost any assault. But almost was not enough. The Marines had crossed the reef that was not supposed to be crossable. They had endured casualties that should have broken them. They had taken positions that were supposed to be impregnable. They had done the impossible because they refused to accept that it was impossible. This was the lesson that echoed through the remainder of the Pacific War. The Japanese could build fortresses. They could train elite troops. They could defend with fanatical courage. But they could not stop the Americans. The mathematics of industrial warfare added up to Japanese defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.